and gentlemen, welcome to the Simpson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Simpson, and it is a great pleasure to see so much interest in this issue. As you are well aware, the Iran nuclear deal became a significant point of interest throughout the presidential campaign. And the now president-elect has stated quite clearly and repeatedly that this deal will be renegotiated by his administration. The vice president-elect has stated equally clearly that the agreement will be, in his words, ripped up following consultations with America's allies. Yet despite this, of course, there are many questions that are swirling around the future of this agreement, and Tehran has been equally clear in saying that it is not the prerogative of one member of this wider consortium around this agreement to abrogate or determine the future of the agreement. So we will get to this and many other issues regarding the future of the Iran nuclear agreement with this extraordinarily, I think you will agree, distinguished panel. My colleague Richard Burchill from Trends Research and Analysis and Advisory, will moderate the discussion and introduce the panel. But first, I wanted to extend a special welcome to my friend and our partner in hosting this event, Dr. Ahmed El-Hamli, who is the founder of Trends in Abu Dhabi, and Ahmed will provide some opening remarks and then pass the baton to his colleague Richard to moderate the panel. So with that, again, welcome all of you to our speakers. Welcome to Stimson, and Ahmed, the dais is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here and participating in the event. I'd like to thank Brian and the Simpson Center for our partnership and the excellent work of the Simpson staff in bringing this event to our group. This morning, we will be examining security and insecurity in the wake of the agreement with Iran nuclear deal. I want to thank all of our speakers for attending today, and I'm looking forward to their views and the discussion. In this briefing opening remarks, I wish to make some observation on the Iran deal with a view from the region. I fully understand how Iran is just one of a number of key security issues facing the world and the United States. However, from the region, the picture is different. At the moment, the Middle East is unfortunately suffering from a great deal of instability and insecurity. There is no doubt the agreement with Iran is necessary as part of the security framework regionally and globally. Looking forward, let me voice a number of concerns from the view of the region regarding relationships with Iran and security. The nuclear deal covers just one issue of Iran's security presence. I wish to remind the audience that Iran remains on the US government list of states sponsors of terrorism. The status cannot be overlooked or dismissed, as Iran's support of terrorism is a key part of its foreign policy in the region. At present, Iran is openly supporting terrorist organizations around the region. The deputy commander of Iranian Revolutionary Guard has spoken of victories achieved by Iran's offspring in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The director of Iranian Center for Strategic Research and advisor of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has publicly spoken of Iran's support for terrorist non-state actors in the region, calling it a line of resistance that begins in Iran and passes through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Iran has made it clear that its support for instability and insecurity in the region is in its interest, and it will continue to pursue this path. Approaches to security and Iran have to count for its regional actions. The impact of the conflicts across the Middle East are being felt around the world, and A key factor in resolving these conflicts will require Iran no longer supporting armed non-state actors across the region. Iran openly and explicitly support armed non-state actors, many of whom are on a range of official lists of designated terrorist groups. This behavior is a direct violation of international law, prohibiting states from interfering in the domestic affairs of other states, and is action contrary to the global efforts to counter terrorism. In this regard, a further aspect of Iran's foreign policy must also be discussed. The system of religious dictatorship, known as Wilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, is the key to understanding how Iran operates. Khomeini created this system in 1979, and it persists today, regardless of what political elites in Iran may claim. In this system of governance, Iran has been exploiting sectarian differences in Islam, leading to conflict and insecurity. The constitution of Iran is based on Wilayat al-Faqih, and Iran has publicly spoken on implementing this form of government in other states in the region, in particular in Iraq. As we discussed here at Stimson last week, the politicization of religion does not contribute to stability or security, no matter how it is pursued. Expressed at the event spokes of Iran's role in politicizing religion, and from the region's view, this matter needs to be addressed. What we tend to see is how the religious dimensions of Iran foreign policy and aggressive military posturing are often marginalized and overlooked. From the regional perspective, this is hard to understand. A quick look at the Iranian constitutional political system clearly shows how the religious-based supreme leader and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard hold the real power under the constitution and have come to control the Iranian state, and all aspects of this power is then used to assert Iranian policy across the region. We see continual efforts by the US and others to appeal to moderate or reform-minded groups and individuals in Iran in the hope they can bring about change. From what I can see, despite the extensive US efforts to modify the behavior of the Iranian government, no such change has been brought about since 1970 to 79. I understand that Iran does have elections, and from the Western view, this gives opportunities to hope that things may change. But the entrenchment of the supreme leader, his supporters, including military, is backed by the current constitution of Iran and unlikely to change. Alongside this, the military has created a deep presence in all aspects of the Iranian system, and it does not appear to offer the reform outlook much hope. Going forward, if the Iranian deal is going to contribute to security in the region and globally, we have to keep a number of things in mind. First, if the US is serious about security in the region, it must work more closely with its regional allies who live with Iran day to day. A major criticism of the nuclear deal was the lack of official involvement of the GCC countries. We understand how superpowers work, but they cannot ignore their allies who have a much closer eye to the situation. Second, Iran must be kept not only to the spirit of the agreement, but to the letter. We have signed an international legal treaty that should be treated as such where the details matter. We cannot be flexible and forgiving Iran as Iran always exploit the situation and pretend to upholding the spirit of this agreement. Third, we must keep in mind that Iran remains a state supporter for terrorism, and this support for terrorism is based on the politicization of religion. Iran's support is not covered in any way. It is open and explicit. This must change if Iran is serious about bringing security to the region, and the US and other key states must keep reminding Iran of this. I wish once again to thank everyone for coming today, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. As Brian said, I'm Dr. Richard Burchill, the Director of Research at Trends. You have the bios of all of our speakers in your seat, so I'm not going to go into introductions. What we're going to do is each speaker will give us some short remarks on their views on security in Iran in relation to the nuclear deal, and then we'll open up to a wider discussion and see your thoughts as well. So, without any further ado, David, the floor is yours, please.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I hate to go first, given what's been happening. I must confess, I thought Hillary would win, and wrote my speech before the election. So, trying to figure out what to say now. I mean, the first thing I would say is, I mean, my group is a nuclear non-proliferation group that we work all over the world, looking at nuclear programs. North Korea gets a lot of our attention, Pakistan, and Iran certainly does. But when we look at Iran, I think fundamentally we see that you have a deal that's, in a sense, kicked the can down the road. That countries seek nuclear weapons for security reasons. They keep nuclear weapons for security reasons. And the security situation doesn't seem to be changing significantly in the Middle East. That would lead me to believe that Iran would do anything but eventually seek nuclear weapons again if it felt that things were not going as well as it hoped. I don't see them in any rush to do that. I think they get direct benefits from this deal. Namely, they get to rebuild their economy and in a sense make themselves immune from sanctions in the future, or at least make it much more difficult to affect them with sanctions. And you see them racing to try to, certainly having difficulty, but trying to rebuild their, let me say it this way, create their industrial infrastructure so that they can enter, in a sense, the ability to make modern high-tech equipment. They've been very dependent on foreign acquisition, mostly illegal for that, but they're trying to become much more indigenous. Now, in that, I think companies are right to resist helping them. I mean, we advise companies in Europe about these sanctions. Iran continues to acquire things illegally for its missile program, probably for its armaments industry. It works in China. In China, it can buy anything, anywhere. They can buy US equipment, they can buy German equipment, Japanese equipment through shady trading companies in China, and China does very little to enforce its own export control laws or its sanctions. And I doubt very much it's going to be doing very much to enforce what we call the procurement channel under the JCPOA. And so Iran continues to buy these things illegally, and at least as a company dealing in high tech, they may buy your stuff illegally via what you thought was a legitimate sale to a place like China. And so I think companies need to exercise great caution in dealing with the Iranian industry. And you've seen no indication that they're going to back down and they say publicly, they will acquire the equipment they feel they need for their defense industry. Even after the deal was done, the Parliamentary Commission looking into this made that exact statement. Prior, President Rouhani has said, yes, we're proud that we break sanctions. So it's not often when you have the president of a country that makes statements that they're going to break your laws. And that brings me to one other point. If this deal is going to survive the Trump administration, and I must say, listening to the news, I have no connection with the Trump administration, so I'm speaking from kind of what open sources on this potential administration or future administration. I think they will probably throw the deal aside. I mean, and I would imagine, I witnessed how the Bush administration killed the agreed framework, which was a deal we were supporting pretty heavily in the 1990s, despite some misgivings. I mean, they'll set it up so Iran will leave the deal. And so I don't expect them to come in, although, this is a surprising election. But I would, and part of that depends on who's going to be Secretary of State. In the Bush administration, Colin Powell put the brakes on a quick dropping of the agreed framework. And then once it was dropped, he also started a process to try to create a negotiating process to kind of get back to a better outcome. So the personnel will matter. And if there is somebody who's a little more reasonable on this, then it may turn out that the walk back could happen more slowly. But I personally think it probably will. And but I would say, you know, could something be offered to strengthen this deal? And I think that it could. Dr. Homley mentioned essentially enforce the thing. I don't think the Obama administration's done a good job of enforcing it. We spend a lot of time working on enforcement issues in this country, and they've been told to pull back. There were direct denials of ability to extradite, to do undercover operations for the sake of this deal. And I think one thing that could happen is that this deal be enforced. Iran goes out and breaks the laws. And it would be good to arrest those people that do it, and they're breaking U.S. laws. And so why not enforce it? Broader, I think there's been too much emphasis on kind of appeasing Iran. And let me be blunt. I mean, I gave a talk a couple weeks ago, and a very senior State Department official came up to me before I talked and said, Iran will get whatever it wants in this administration. I don't think that's how the State Department Public Affairs Office would put it. But there is a sense that anything that rocks the boat is by nature opposed. And I think that has to stop if it's going to survive in the Trump administration. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And we've looked at cases of exemptions being granted to aspects of the deal, limitations on the deal, and the one that attracted up us was something called a hot cell. It has to do with basically, the worry is that could help Iran develop the capability to separate plutonium. There were exemptions done in secret by the Joint Commission to exempt some of the hot cells, which over a certain size are simply beta. And so some pre-existing ones, probably more than we thought were there, were exempted from the limitations and allowed to operate. And that's one issue, but what attracted our attention is that Iran came back soon after and said, we want more hot cells. They approached a supplier. And these hot cells not only would violate the condition of the initial set, namely size, but also get into closer to being able to actually dissolve irradiated fuel in order to see its condition. It's called post-irradiation examination. And so you had, within months, Iran already pushing, in a sense, to get another exemption on hot cells that would undermine further this ban on Iran having the ability to separate plutonium for at least 10 years, if not 15 years. And so I think those kind of exemptions have to be blocked. You can't go back and redo the previous exemptions, but you certainly can send a signal to Iran that, no, you're not going to get any more. And again, I'm not sure that would be enough for Trump by any means, but I think for those of us who worry about how this is being implemented, it would provide some ammunition to argue that this deal should be saved or kept in place. Another thing is, I think there's been a misunderstanding of this deal on the verification. The deal does not settle the basic question, does Iran have a secret nuclear weapons program, either now, in the future, or in the past? There were two conditions put in the deal to try to deal with this. One is the additional protocol. The second is to ban certain types of nuclear weaponization activities that would make it harder for Iran to work on the sort of the development of nuclear weapons. Those are not verified now. You need to go to military sites. That's where those activities would take place. And you can't go to military sites under the current deal. The IA has a tough time going to those places. They have a right to go there under the traditional safeguards agreement, reinforced by the additional protocol, but it's not going very well. And you don't see them going to Parchin, you don't see them going to some of the military industries. Iran has maintained the position that military sites are off limits. And the deal was unfortunately structured where that could be tested through, does Iran agree to a broader conclusion under the additional protocol, which is really, is Iran's nuclear program peaceful? That's really the bottom line on that. But in the deal, Iran doesn't really have to do anything to get sanctions off on the missiles and the conventional armaments. It doesn't, IA works on it, but after a certain amount of time, they're going to get those sanctions relief even if they don't cooperate. And Iran is going to certainly try to get the IAEA to weaken itself further on these questions of access. I mean, they got this Parchin deal that they got was certainly a weakening of how they would normally do environmental monitoring, one of which is central tenets is if you get an ambiguous result. They did detect uranium. If you get an ambiguous result, you go back. And they haven't been back. And I don't think they're very optimistic about going back. So I think on the question of developing confidence in the absence of undeclared nuclear activities, verifying these weaponization conditions, the agreement is not very substantial. It's not the most intrusive verification agreement ever set up. What happened in Libya is more intrusive. What happened in Iraq is much more intrusive. Even what happened in South Africa, in practice was more intrusive than what Iran has allowed the IAEA to do under the JCPOA. So I think if you want to help this process, then it's important to focus again on the verification, focusing on this whole question of potentially undeclared activities.
Okay, David, could you just wrap up, please?
Okay. Now, the last point I want to make is the deal can be changed. Joint Commission has quite a bit of power, and I can give you an example. The JCPOA says that near 20% enriched uranium will be in fuel elements. There was an episode last fall where Iran had done something against the agreement, at least an oral agreement. The US went back in and said, well, that's not enough. We need that the elements would, if they aren't already been placed in the Tehran research reactor, they'll be irradiated. And one could argue whether that was sufficient, but it was a change. It's not in the JCPOA. So any fresh near 20% fuel elements have to be irradiated, and the IAEA verifies that the radiation level is sufficient. That was done, and that's not in the deal. So in this agreement, you can change the conditions if the parties agree. And I think one of the things that needs to be looked at is what conditions need to be changed that would go toward the objections to this agreement by its opponents. It may be that it's just too much, but it may be that there is something that can be done. Particularly, people are worried about Iran's centrifuge R&D. And you don't find these things out because the IAEA report is just sparse or just devoid of information. I mean, you have to talk to the IAEA, you have to talk to the governments. Iran's pushing the envelope on the centrifuge R&D. And that may be one area. The need for something beyond 10 to 15 years is another. It'd be a lot nicer to kick the can down the road 20 to 30 years on some of these issues than just 10 to 15. So let me just end there, and happy to discuss any of this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, David. Lacey, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. So I have quite a few responses, but I without sort of relitigating the terms of the deal itself that was negotiated, I would say just first and foremost that it's important to remember that where we were prior to the negotiation of this deal. Iran was at the precipice of a nuclear weapon. We were talking about war. Israel was certainly considering a strike on Iran that would have, without a doubt, pulled the U.S. into that conflict. So this is a very real place that we were, and I think it's very easy for us to forget that that's the environment in which this deal was negotiated. At the time, as someone watching the non-proliferation and nuclear aspects of this deal, the additional protocol was considered. I mean, I think you remember very much something that we weren't sure we could ever get Iran to agree to. A lot of the things that were negotiated in this deal were actually much farther than any of us would have ever guessed. And I think that obviously this is not a perfect deal. Obviously, this deal cannot solve all of the issues that we have with Iran. And the ongoing relationship between the U.S. and Iran will always be unstable. It will for a very long time, it will be shaky. There's a long history of mistrust, and overcoming that mistrust is going to take a very long time, and it's not going to be solved by a nuclear agreement. There's a lot more to do to get to a point where we can have a relationship where we can really trust each other, and we can consider Iran a country that isn't going to violate the terms of some of these deals. But what we can do, I believe we have done with this nuclear agreement, we have addressed the biggest concern that we have with regard to Iran, which is its nuclear program, which was very, very close to not being a nuclear program, but a nuclear weapon. And by striking this deal with Iran, we have given ourselves at least 10 years. So I think that where we sort of fundamentally disagree is not so much on the details of the deal, but on the kicking the can down the road. I would say that's actually a good thing. A lot can change in 10 years. 8 years ago we elected Barack Obama. So I think that it's important to remember that much can change, not just in our country in 10 years, but also in Iran in 10 years. And we've given ourselves 10 years now to attempt to change that. And so that's key, just to start out. I would argue, though, that the non-proliferation value of this agreement is strong and that the deal is working. The IAEA continues to verify that Iran is complying with its obligations under the deal. I think we've had, a couple of missteps here and there. They've been very quickly resolved, even very, as much as yesterday there was a report of a heavy water incident that is being resolved quickly. I think that these kinds of interactions were unheard of not so long ago between the U.S. and Iran. We were not having the kind of interactions where an issue was identified, Iran immediately responded, and immediately started working toward a resolution. This is I think, deserving of some credit in what this deal has achieved. It's also important to remember, as we're considering a Trump presidency and a possible, we're considering the very real Trump presidency and what that will mean, that pulling out of this deal, it really is, for national security purposes, it's not an option. This would be painted in Iran as a win for Iran. This is a deal that we have negotiated with a number of international partners. It's not a deal just between the U.S. and Iran. It's not one that we can simply go back to the table and say we're ready to renegotiate this deal, which, by the way, Trump has said that he would renegotiate, not necessarily just rip up the current deal. He's a businessman. He wants to do deals, right? So we can expect that he may make some attempt in that direction. We can expect, or he may punt it to Congress, and Congress may actually be the entity which is sort of doing more to attempt to renegotiate this deal. But whatever form this takes, we need to be very aware that there are other countries involved in this negotiation. Those countries are not unhappy with the terms of the deal that was negotiated, and I would say would be very unlikely to agree to come back to the table, and even more importantly, would be particularly unlikely to reinstitute the sanctions that allowed us to get this deal in the first place. It's the tough international sanctions that were put in place that really put Iran in a bad economic position to need to agree to this deal and to need to move toward being a better actor on the world stage, and this also shouldn't be discounted in the process of negotiating this deal. This isn't something we can simply walk back and reinstitute, particularly without the buy-in of our international partners. I would say also that just to very lightly touch on the Trump presidency, because none of us, frankly, has any idea what he's going to do, and there are a lot of bigger issues, I think, that are going to take up the majority of his time when he comes into office, things that are more important to his base and that he's made very clear will be a top priority. This is going to be an interesting one given his emphasis on the relationship with Russia. Russia's not going to want us to simply rip up this deal. They're one of our negotiating partners, and this deal is important to them. So if we see the Trump that is bombastic and that simply might rip things up, sure, maybe that might happen. But if we see the Trump that is a deal maker and a businessman and values his relationships with other countries, which is the Trump that we saw in his acceptance speech, then I think that we could see a very different scenario. Now, the more immediate concern is that Iran will be considering an extension of the Iran Sanctions Act, or Congress will be considering an extension of the Iran Sanctions Act when they return. And whether or not that is a clean extension will be a question. Other proposals include additional funding for Israel and some addressing of Iran's ballistic missile program and other things that sort of have been a part of these conversations all along, but are not a part of the deal, and so therefore should not be a part of new sanctions. So a clean extension would obviously be the least threatening to the existence of the deal, but Congress will be having this conversation in the very near future, and we have yet to see how emboldened those who are looking for change will be by this election.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lacey. Mark, the floor is yours. Could I just ask all the speakers, pull the mic a bit closer to you to help the sound crew out with picking up your voice. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be on the panel with David, Lacey, and Link. Something I haven't had the opportunity to do much over the past decade because I was in London. And one thing about being in London is that that almost universally in Europe there is great support for the Iran deal and great apprehension of it falling apart. And so I want to reconfirm some of the points Lacey made here about how this is an 8-party deal. One party cannot unilaterally abrogate it, but it can do things to make it fail. And if the United States were to impose sanctions on Iran for the problematic behavior that Ahmed mentioned in the beginning, and it is problematic, it would not be seen as legitimate sanctions that would make it, that would warrant the deal falling apart, because the deal is so much more important to everybody that has been participating in it to limit Iran's nuclear activity. The different problems with the deal, as David outlined, are not going to be renegotiated now. Now, some of them can be adjusted, and in fact, some of them have been adjusted marginally. I understand. I don't have this confirmed, but David actually did the world a great benefit when he mentioned some of the aspects of the not side deals, but under the Joint Commission, under the terms of the agreement, the Joint Commission takes up issues that weren't anticipated or that came up, and it is able to make some decisions on them. They made decisions in confidentiality because that was the way they operated under the deal. But because people like David have mentioned, hey, what about these hot cells and so forth? Hot cells were anticipated in the deal. But okay, so the Joint Commission, I believe, is now going to not do it in secret anymore. It's going to be public, and that's for the benefit, because it's important that we know. At least it's going to be public when any adjustments are made that are significant, that are that affect Iran's ability in any way to produce enriched uranium. Many of the small things that the Joint Commission decided don't significantly affect Iran's ability to enrich uranium. I mean, for example, there was an amount of low enriched uranium in waste, sludge, that wasn't counted in the limit of 300 kilograms. And it was pointed out by people like David that, hey, that maybe, should have been counted in the 300. But, the IAEA never counted that waste when it was counting the amount of low enriched uranium had. And so it makes sense that it wouldn't necessarily be counted now, especially if you can't recover the low enriched uranium and the sludge in any time that would make it at all advantageous to Iran. But anything that would be advantageous is going to be made public, I understand. So that's a good thing. But on the bigger things about trying to change Iran's behavior in the many ways that it is acting problematically, how do we best do this? Do we impose new sanctions on Iran that Iran will say are a reimposition of the sanctions that were relieved under the deal, and they'll cry foul, and they will respond in their incremental way of producing more low enriched uranium, marginally. It won't be seen as a major violation of the deal, but there'll be a tit for tat. There'll be an escalation. And who will the world blame if things start falling apart? They're going to blame the party that first imposed the sanctions, unless Iran does something significantly different than the way it has been acting. So let's look at Iran's behavior in the various ways that have been outlined, and I think many of us know, to see has their behavior been significantly different than it was before the deal. And I would argue no. In some ways, marginally it has been worse. Iran has been harassing U.S. ships in the Gulf more than it was before. Iran has been supplying more support to Houthi rebels in Yemen than it was before. But it's not because of the deal in the latter case. It's because the Houthi rebels were losing worse, and so Iran was trying to rectify the balance. And you got to remember, Iran didn't start the war in Yemen, and Iran's not the one that has been dropping cluster bombs. Iran's not the one that has been targeting civilian facilities. If Iran had been doing that kind of things, hell would break loose. They'd be sanctioned to death. It's actually our partner was doing some of that stuff. And, the chastisement has not been so loud. In some other areas, Iran's support for Syria, well, that predated the deal. I don't like it at all, but it's not significantly different. And Iran's support for Hezbollah, for Hamas, this is all what they've been doing, maybe marginally worse. But it's not of a scale that would lead the world to say, yeah, we've really got to come down on them like a ton of bricks now. The area that you might think is worse now than it was before is Iran's missile testing. And this, was not part of the deal, so they haven't violated the deal by their missile testing, although any procurement of parts for the missiles would violate the deal. Countries that engage in that should be, I would agree, should be sanctioned and imprisoned, or at least they should be charged. But Iran's testing of its, the testing of its missiles doesn't violate the deal, nor does it violate the Security Council resolution, which now calls on Iran not to develop missiles, but doesn't mandate that they do so. So it's not illegal. It violates the spirit of the deal. And if they were to increase the pace of the testing, that would be a legitimate concern. I think the world would legitimately be concerned about that. So let's look at the pace of the testing. 3 tests last year, 5 announced this year. Well, that's more than took place any year between 2006 and 2015. No, I got that wrong. I'm sorry. That was more than that took place in the last couple years before the deal. But it's not more than Iran had been doing when there weren't negotiations. So let me get this straight. Between 2006 and 2012, Iran tested missiles, on average 3 to 5 a year, and now they're back doing that. But they weren't doing that during the negotiations, so they're back on par basically with where they were. It's not a significant change. Nor are they testing longer range missiles. Their emphasis is on the accuracy of missiles, which doesn't mean that they're making these for nuclear weapons. Accuracy is important for conventional warheads. You can contrast the pace with a country of concern that really is on an accelerated pace. North Korea, a couple dozen this year alone. It's a vastly different pace of development. There's also no evidence that, unlike North Korea, no evidence that Iran is developing intermediate range ballistic missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles. No evidence of that, at least as my institute assesses it. If they were, that would be problematic. They do have a space launch program, and the Simorg rocket could be adapted for ballistic missile use. No country's ever done that, adapted a space launch for ballistic missiles, but Iran could. But it wouldn't be a very capable missile, wouldn't be a very good missile for Iran, because it would have to be put in a silo. It couldn't be mobile, and in a silo it would be a sitting duck for preemption. So, if Iran went off on ICBMs or intermediate range ballistic missiles, yeah, let's sanction them. But without Iran significantly engaging in worse behavior, you won't have the rest of the world with you if you impose sanctions. So there won't be universal UN sanctions, which were so important in the Iran deal. There won't be EU sanctions because all 28 member states of the EU would have to go along with it, and I think it would be hard to get that consensus. So the United States would be alone. Now, secondary sanctions can be very persuasive, but you generally do need a partner, people to go along with it. And Europeans won't go along with it. They'll balk at it. Last word I'll say, it wasn't just sanctions that got the Iran deal. It was also a willingness to compromise, a willingness to give in on somewhere. So it was a give and take. So to make a new deal, sanctions would be helpful in persuading Iran, but the Trump administration would have to also be willing to give something. And I'm not sure they would be so inclined.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Okay. Finally, Lincoln, please, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Richard, and let me start by welcoming Ahmed and Richard and the Trends Institute. Stimson is delighted to be partnering with you today, and it's been a good collaboration and a good relationship, which I hope will only grow. Let me thank my fellow panelists as well. A lot of great information and analysis. Just to sort of set the tone of where I am coming from, being the chairman of a nonpartisan think tank has been a great excuse not to really endorse anything in the political process. I've tried to stand back. There's so much negativity that that the partisans on each side injected into their discussion of public policy that I thought there was a big wide open space there for just putting out ideas that might appeal to anybody, regardless of who they support. That may be a pipe dream, but that's the spirit in which I want to lend a few remarks today. I would say, Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, has spoken on this, and his position obviously has evolved. I remember the primaries debates when all of the political opponents, the Republican opponents on the stage said, "I'm going to tear the deal up, I'm going to tear the deal up," and his only words were, "It's a contract." I thought, what an interesting reaction. It's a contract. Let me explain why I think that's actually the beginning of wisdom for where he goes from here. 2 points. One, if the president-elect goes about tearing up executive agreements, which is something that members of Congress might think is sort of an internecine issue. The president keeps doing things, we never get involved, let's tear up those executive agreements. If that happens, he's pretty much debasing the currency of the presidency, because why would the P5+1 in any similar endeavor spend years negotiating something if they thought that whatever the paper it was written on would not be valued in Washington because it's an executive agreement? We have decades of diplomacy based on executive agreements where there is an enduring sort of franchise called the United States, which is generally respected. And I think that's a tradition that this president-elect would do well to continue for his own good. The Republicans have been out of office for a while, so they've forgotten that they actually liked the power of the executive branch when they ran it. And so that's something to think about. The other thing, I'm sort of thinking all the way back to when President Reagan was elected. There's a lot of discussion about what happened when the hostages were released from Tehran. But the fact is that the uncertainty of an incoming president may have had a decisive effect on Iran's thinking, that let's get rid of the hostages. It will embarrass President Carter, but we'll release them before Reagan can make a decision to exert any leverage against our interests. That's a thought process that they should think about, not to threaten something dangerous, but to leave Iran in some uncertainty and to make them think maybe we should find a way not to be adverse to the new Trump administration. What can we do to sort of clean the slate and show that we're not going to be at war with you? What troubled me so much about the last few years of negotiation was not any particular point of view on this. You had the administration reaching out and engaged in extensive diplomacy. You had people in Congress, and I was at dinners with their aides throughout that process saying, we're not hearing anything. So we're just going to write sanctions bills as a bargaining chip with the executive branch. And I think at some point, the administration had to concede that Congress would have a review process. That was not foreseen at the outset. This internecine fighting between the two branches is very dangerous on major national security issues. And I think this is a moment to say there's got to be a way for that not to be the driving dynamic. There's got to be a way to find some common ground, however general, that everyone says we all accept certain propositions. I have known people in the arms control community for decades, so have you. It's a career path that people have followed that brought us stability with the Soviet Union, that prevented regional war from going to nuclear war. It is an extremely noble tradition. Everyone I know who spent their career in the arms control community, and I'm not one of them, could not believe that anyone would be against the Iran deal. Why? We waited years for a, quote, rogue state nuclear program to be brought under an agreement, and they got it. So, point one, I have no criticism for the nuclear arms control deal that was struck, and it is a contract, and for all the reasons you've heard, no good can come of trying to undo it. I'm not a fan of sanctions. If Iran were like the United States, where an outsider could be allowed to run for office and could somehow sweep the board and become the next supreme leader or change the constitution or whatever would happen there, that would be different. But 80 million Iranians, or 79 million, really don't own the franchise of sovereignty at this point. It would be hard to convince me otherwise, frankly, from all I know about the people of Iran. And so therefore sanctioning them and hurting the teachers and the merchants and the minorities and the women and the kids, the people who have no power, is not a great policy. So I want to invite the Washington community to think strategically about two things. We have some expertise on Iran, but I'm going to tease you with my own view of strategically what drives Iran. And Trends, by the way, thank you very much, has published it in at least Arabic and English, and somebody put it into Farsi as well. It's a different view, but it's meant to stimulate debate, not to be the final word on anything. And the other is, we need a U.S. strategy that starts with principles, that looks at strategic long-term vectors, and that sort of conforms to what Americans should believe in, instead of fighting about who's in charge and whether it's sanctions and whether we tear the agreement up and what to do with the specifics of the arms control deal. We need to understand that we're all the home team and honor each other's views. The Congress has a right to be sort of out of sorts with the deal. They were excluded. Certain things happened that they were told wouldn't happen. And they take a view, many of them, that a very high price was paid for what we got, which is, by the way, one more reason not to give it up. We paid a lot for this, so why would you give up something you paid so much for? So then the question is, let me just tell you what I mean. I've tried to understand Iran from a political development standpoint. My studies going way back were on revolution and on political development, transitions from feudal to modern society, the industrial age, and now it's so fascinating to study the information age, which I think has moved us past the sort of war-making metric that defined the middle of the 20th century. Having looked at particularly what happened after the revolution of '79, which was a blind spot in American analysis, I've seen very little detail on what happened in 1980, 1981. Those are the critical years, so I invite you all, start studying 1980 and 1981. What will you see? You'll see an incredibly vibrant country that actually was the first in Asia to push for a parliament in 1906, that had a nationalist moment in 1953, and we all know the Mossadegh coup, but go back and look at what was behind the Mossadegh idea and how much it resonated with the Iranian people, and the disappointments that occurred in '63 and beyond as the Shah cracked down on dissidents rather than try to find a way to incorporate their voice into Iranian affairs. And so what really happened after Khomeini was welcomed as a hero, an authentic Iranian hero, is that he advanced his constitution, Beliat Faqih, which translated meant, he is the 12th Imam, essentially incarnate, and that in any matters that of consequence, what he says goes. So I always puzzled that the White House, for example, equated verbally President Obama sending a message to President Rouhani. They're not equal. And I think it's dangerous to look at President Rouhani in the same terms as the head of state of the United States of America. The differences are so fundamental that, again, I would have preferred our president to sort of look for a signal from the supreme leader. If you're the people who run Iran, you own the nuclear program, it's your program, what say you? Yay or nay? But we never really did that, and what you now see is essentially the Rouhani-Zarif engagement, and probably I don't question their motives, they probably want to see a rapprochement, just as our side did. But let's be clear, there were two things that the Obama administration sought. One was to curb the nuclear program, and at the end of the day, President Obama held that up and said, look, I did what I had to do. As Lacey said, it was going to be war, I stopped the war. He did. I give him that. But let's be also clear, go back to 2013 at the UNGA, the president reached out to Iran and said this could lead us on a road to better understanding. And I think in good faith, Washington has really tried to give Iran an opportunity to demonstrate some respect for U.S. interests. That's a tough debate now, because there's a lot of people in Congress who are both excluded and who now, with all due respect, Mark, look at what's happened with 4 million Syrians, bombed out of their homes with barrel bombs and with chemicals and whatnot, and even in violation of the chemical agreement.
Yes.
And, come back to me with a DNI estimate of how many people are on the Iran payroll in Syria. Come back to me with that number. I'll give you one. 15,000 Iranians and maybe 40 to 45,000 Hezbollah, Iraqi Shia militia, and Afghani. And what do you think all that cash on the pallets was for that went into Iran Air airplanes? It wasn't to pay teachers on strike in Tehran. They don't get paid in euros. So, look, I don't want to divide Washington any more than it's been divided. What I'm going to tell you, though, is that Syria and Iraq are of huge consequence to Iran. My theory is that what happened in 1980 was that there was an outgrowth of participation where the merchants, the trade unionists, the minorities, women, people ran for office. Some of them were then disqualified, but they gained thousands of votes. Bani Sadr was elected president, the only one with 100% participation. Since then, less than 4% of all sort of registered candidates have ultimately been allowed on the ballot, and in recent decades, less than 2%. So Rouhani is not an accident. They said they were going to engineer the election in January. He became the president. And so we need to be clear on what we're looking at. Why did they do that? Because in 1981, the revolution almost slipped out of their hands, and they shot their way to power. I've seen two neutral academics describe what happened next in June of 1981 as a reign of terror. And so people were driven into exile. Bani Sadr ended up in Paris. And Bazargan, who was a Mossadegh devotee, was the prime minister. When the embassy was taken, he resigned right away. He had no part. This was about the clerics seizing power and imposing essentially a dictatorship. And I've looked at that dictatorship closely, and what I think motivates the regime, and this, I think, I invite people to look at the sort of reformist versus hardline. It's very real, but what is it? Is it something where there's some conformity with U.S. interests inside the ambit of what they would do against one another? And I find that there's a lot of transfer of personnel over time. They're all in the same club, and I am not convinced that reform, however it's meant in Iran, could ever reach a point where there's a conformity of U.S. and Iranian interests. And so I think the beginning of wisdom here is to understand that this regime is afraid of its own people. The revolution, I think the Iran-Iraq war was extended way beyond when they got their territory back in order to keep the state of emergency and conform and essentially confirm Khomeini's power structure. He pushed Montazeri out, who was the Grand Marja, because he was questioning the executions in 1988, which we now have an audio tape this year of Montazeri saying we will be remembered as war criminals. Are we collecting dossiers on the Justice Minister of Iran, who personally approved all 30,000 executions? That's out there. So where are America's values? You could say we want to prevent war, but you could also say, don't we stand for essential human rights? Shouldn't we say something about all these executions? What about keeping Bashar al-Assad in power? They have said that if Damascus goes, the Arab Spring that took down Ben Ali, Mubarak, it hit Deraa, Bashar and the family pulled the guns out, sent in Maher with the tanks. We know what happened, and then it turned into all-out war and chaos. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying that the reason Iran is bleeding cash and casualties in Syria is that they think that it's going to come to Tehran, as it almost did in 1999, as it almost did in 2009. And so you may be surprised to find this. I don't think that military options have any role here for the United States. I think strategy and coherence and unity in Washington would give us credibility. And I think the Europeans could then engage in a conversation with us about the strategy of this regime and to make them decide, are you going to live by international norms in some way, shape, or measure, or are you going to live at peace with your Arab neighbors? And start testing the proposition. And I think that our strongest weapon, frankly, is information. Because as with Russia and China, these great authoritarian regimes in the information age spend half their time denying and changing the information that gets to their people. I think that's more potent than any bombs and bullets, which goodness knows there's enough of them in the world. So again, without giving you a bottom line, I think there's room here to sort of step back and say, look, we're all worn out from the chaos of the election and the partisanship. Can we find some strategic terms that represent U.S. interests? Can we ask our experts to dive deeper and look at the nature of this regime and what's really happening? And then I'd love to see an event that says, is Iran acting out of strength in the Middle East, or are they acting out of great vulnerability? I think there's a great case to be made for the latter. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks to all the panelists. Appreciate it. I mean, it's not often that we get a panel that covers essentially all the major issues. We heard about some of the technical points, the administrative legal points, the views from within, and the views from out with, what the rest of the world thinks. So thanks to all four of you for really providing a stimulating discussion and debate. Now, what I want to do with the questions is we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then I'll ask all the panelists to provide a brief response, if that's all right with everybody. We do have some microphones in the audience. Okay, so what we'll do is start on the side of the room. Gentlemen, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Rafael Leal with the Brazilian Embassy. So it is my understanding that all the sanction relief that has been brought to Iran were put in place by Obama using executive orders and his ability to waive sanctions after the deal. So by that logic, if I'm correct, what would prevent Mr. Trump just to re-edit those executive orders and my English is not very good, but not to renew the waivers? So my question is, can he do that? Do you think that could happen after Mr. Trump takes office in January? And then once the deal is in the trash, Iran will be back developing nuclear weapons. That is my assessment after living 3 years in Iran. And the Revolutionary Guards will get more power in the Iranian political game. Rouhani and Zarif will be out of the picture, and the aggressive behavior that we see today by the Revolutionary Guards and not Iran on the Gulf, on Syria, because they are the ones that, in my opinion, control the foreign policy for the near Middle East, not Rouhani, not Zarif. So after that happens, what would you, especially Mr. David Albright, would recommend, if you were a low-level bureaucracy diplomat like me, to the Trump administration and say, look, we trashed the deal, and this is going to happen. They're going back to their nuclear program. So what do you do then? And would that be in the interest of Israel? Would Israel use that, or AIPAC and the Republican Congress, to say, let's trash the deal, let's push for more sanctions until they capitulate and all that we heard when the deal was being put in place? So do you think that would happen, if I may?
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. An individual in the front here?
Thank you. I'm Jenna Lifitz with the Weekly Standard. The IAEA said in a confidential report the day after the election that Iran has again exceeded the nuclear deal's limit for heavy water, which many of you mentioned. I'm wondering if you're concerned that these reports are being politicized either in content or the timing of their release to manage violations, and more broadly, was this a violation and why is it significant?
Okay, there's a fair bit of meat on those two questions, so we'll take responses from across the board, and then we'll get back to the audience. Who wants? David, you want to go first, please?
Yeah, I can try. Janet, I don't think the IA is politicizing it. I mean, it just came out because of when the impending Board of Governors meeting is. I mean, we have a copy. We haven't published it yet, but the problem with the heavy water is Iran worked out a loophole in the deal. No one expected that Iran would have a kind of a place to cache its heavy water in Oman. It's put in kind of a bonded warehouse according to the Secretary of Energy. It's not under IAEA monitoring. If it was a normal IAEA material like enriched uranium, it would still count against the inventory of Iran. Once it got to its destination, whether it's US or Russia or Europe, then it would be taken off the Iranian inventory. But in this loophole, as soon as it leaves Iran, it's taken off the inventory of heavy water. And there's some discomfort at the IAEA about that. And Iran has sort of gotten used to it. So in a sense, Iran's exceeded the limit and said, well, we've committed to send it out, which they will do. But in a strict interpretation of the deal, they shouldn't be exceeding the limit. They can't just say, well, we're exceeding the limit and we'll eventually send it out, or even soon send it out. They should just dump it in the river as surplus material. And it's not radioactive, and they're making far too much than they need. They're not going to be a responsible player in the international heavy water market. The heavy water, it's questionable whether it's even of the right purity for modern commercial use of heavy water. I mean, we're still trying to work on this and get to the bottom of it. But I think there's an example where the Trump administration would be expected to just say, no, it's a violation and you can't exceed it. And if you're going to exceed it, then dump it in the river. Now on this actually excellent question, I mean, I don't know the answer. I saw in the press today that someone was positing the administration could simply stop the waivers or reverse them. And I think it'll have to be, do you think it's not, Chris? I mean,
there's a law that needs to be renewed for that to happen.
Okay,
no
well,
there's no law.
Okay, oh, that's right, so that's right, so then, I think it depends on who they put in. I mean, that's certainly one of the things I'm watching for is who's going to become Secretary of State, who's going to become Undersecretary, I mean, what are their attitudes toward the deal? I mean, one thing that isn't well known is, and we were involved in it, Congress wasn't united on the Republican side on this. I mean, the reason there was oversight from people like Corker or Cardin was they opposed the deal, but they wanted to exercise oversight on the deal and try to, in a sense, make it better. Well, the leadership wanted nothing really to do with that. That they just wanted to oppose the deal. And they blocked successive efforts to try to create legislation for, in a sense, institutionalize that, because the original bill by Corker isn't sufficient to really do the job. But the leadership didn't want that. They just wanted to stand against the deal. And so I don't know how that conflict's going to be resolved. That leadership is still there. And now you may have players in the Trump administration that just want to kill the deal. And now how will they do it? I don't know. I don't think, I mean, watching the North Korean thing, I think they're smart. They'll probably engineer it in a way that they're not the ones walking away. And it may take a year or two, but it's something to worry about. Now, what happens if that takes place? I must confess, I mean, we're largely responsible for pioneering this idea that breakout is a measure of the threat of the Iranian nuclear program. And we spent years working on it. I mean, people in the sort of the deal supporters now attacked us, said breakout is a meaningless concept in some cases, even though we knew it was implicit in or deep in the whole negotiations, and we know that it's a metric. It just measures a threat. It's like a ruler that you want to know how close is Iran to being able to make enough weapon-grade uranium for a bomb. It's just, is it a month now? Is it 6 months, 12 months, 7 months, whatever it is, it's a measurement. But underneath that, that's not what the problem was, and the solution was not that. What was at stake here was that the Obama administration rejected the idea that we could live with an Iranian nuclear weapon. And it said, if you, and that was a common position in the arms control community, that we could live with an Iranian nuclear weapon. We would deal with it like we dealt with the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Obama administration rejected that and said, look, if Iran goes down that path, there will be military strikes. So I think the first thing that Trump would do is reactivate that policy. That yes, if you want to build up your program, just know we're watching. You cross a certain line that we define, then you're going to be subjected to military strikes. And then, and I think in this, what we learned prior to the negotiation of the deal is Iran is very hesitant to cross that line. It understands that it cannot win a war, and it knows that in a modern warfare, they won't even see U.S. troops on the ground, and so they can retaliate as they see fit, but they also know that the U.S. can also retaliate and actually up the ante dramatically and destroy even more of Iran's infrastructure. So they have to worry about it, not only the first strike, but they have to worry about the next one. And that's actually why Israel can't do this, because Israel can strike once and that's it. You have to have a military force that can strike multiple times over an extended period of time in order to, if Iran doesn't get the message the first time, that they understand that they're going to get it the second. So I think so that threat of attack would become front and center again, and I think sanctions would be applied unilaterally. I mean, my group, I probably shouldn't say this too publicly now, we opposed the sanctions of Congress. The Obama administration vehemently opposed these sanctions. The entire Plowshares-funded community made it a point of principle to oppose the sanctions. Now, everyone likes to take credit for those sanctions now, bringing Iran to the negotiating table. And we opposed it because we didn't think our European buddies should be put into that kind of situation of secondary sanctions. But they worked. And I think that will be done again, and the world will simply be dragged along. Now, we may disagree. We may, my group, we may say, look, I live in Germany now much of the year, it's tough to just think you could force companies to abide by these sanctions. But U.S. financial system is pretty strong.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. Lacey, anything to add to that?
Sure, just to clarify, the sanctions we're talking about, I think we need to make a distinction between the two different sets of sanctions.
But before moving on to sanctions, could you please respond to the questions
Sorry.
posed? And you guys can argue
I
about sanctions
will.
after the event.
Just the international sanctions were actually taken forward by the Obama administration, not.
No, I'm talking about the
disagree with.
congressional mandated
Right.
sanctions, which were the really powerful ones.
Okay. I would say that, but with regard to politicization of the report, I agree, actually, that I don't think the IAEA is necessarily politicizing this kind of information. I do think that any time that, as some of this that gets to the media, the IAEA reports, I mean, they always go to the media. Sort of, it's a common, it happens every time we sort of reach this point where we're having a board of governors report. And any time that there's anything in there that looks like a bit of that Iran is straying in any way from the deal, the media, I think, it has a tendency to jump on that and that's that will continue to be the case. I think that when seeing those kinds of reports, it's important to ask, how is Iran responding. I think it's sort of you can look at this in two different ways. You can look at it as Iran shouldn't have done it in the first place, sure, or you can look at this very considered quite intransigent country that we have had trouble dealing with in the past now is responding to any note of a violation by saying, no, of course we're taking care of it, we'll have it done in a week. Sure. Is it not perfect, like a lot of the things that have to do with this deal? No. Is it much, much safer than Iran having a nuclear weapon? Yes, absolutely it is. Also on Trump and throwing out the deal, I think we can all try to make projections, but none of them are going to be quite right. Of course, there are a lot of paths he can take to throw out the deal. It will have yet to be seen. Of course, obviously,
Absolutely,
also
yeah.
Congress is going to play a big role.
Okay, great. Couple questions in the middle. One in the back, please, and then we'll come to the front. Yeah.
Thanks. Michelle Kellerman with NPR. Many of you said that the Europeans wouldn't go along with more sanctions, but what about this idea of better enforcement? Would they go along with that? And secondly, on the question of personalities, what difference does it make if he goes for a Bolton, a Corker, or a Gingrich?
Okay, great. And question in the front here, please.
Thanks, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Great discussion. Just legally, in legal terms, what happens if the United States stops abiding by the agreement? There's a UN Security Council resolution. The U.S. would be in violation of that resolution. Other countries, I presume, would still be obliged to go forward. So if you could comment on that, and also, I think the biggest concern now is that with the Trump presidency, Iran will not see the economic benefits it expected with the deal, because all of those companies in Europe that were waiting to see whether Hillary won or Trump won will now say we better not go in, and that especially includes the big banks. So are you concerned about these kinds of deals? Will Total go forward? Will Boeing sell the planes? What is going to happen in your view? And could that jettison the deal from the Iranian perspective?
That was a very good question concerning Europe. Mark, do you want to sort of take that?
Yeah.
Would enforcement be possible?
The kind of enforcement that David was talking about is eminently possible. It's enforcing procurement violations, and I expect that the Europeans would go along with that. But they won't go along with the imposition of new additional sanctions unless there's a significant violation on Iran's part. To Barbara's legal question, it's a very important one here. Let's remember, what the Iran, there's a snapback mechanism in the Iran deal, okay, in the United Nations Security Council. If any country says, hey, there's a violation, then the deal is abrogated. Everything snaps back. Now, it's usually been anticipated to be the United States saying, hey, Iran violated. But in this case, the United States imposes new sanctions. Iran says, violation, and we go back to square one. So the limits they come off. And yeah, I am concerned that I think there's a real reason to be concerned that the companies that have been holding off to date because of concern about what the prospects would be in the next year have every reason to wait longer. Will the deals already in the works go through? I suspect companies that are involved in these deals will probably kind of slow down the negotiations a bit, because already they depend on Iran coming up with the financing, and that's problematic. So I think we're probably in a period of molasses in terms of commercial deals with Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. Lincoln.
Well, again, I'm going to try to give you a view that's unbounded by the Washington sort of conversation, which is another way of saying that if all we're talking about is sanctions provisions inside the deal, sanctions on the Hill, which is exactly sort of what's on the table, we will never get at either a strategy or leverage on Iran. I don't think, yes, it's embarrassing for them to be sanctioned by the world. They lose face. People know it. More money is better than less money. I don't think that's decisive. My theory is the day the president sailed the Sixth Fleet away from the Syrian coast, In Tehran, they knew that Bashar al-Assad could probably survive, that the transition process in Geneva would fail. And of course, Bashar then opened the jails. You may think I'm off the subject. I'm not. He opened the jails, he opened the borders, he let the bonfire called Daesh grow wildly out of control. A lot of people said, well, this is the guy with the jacket and tie and the white shirt, and the Alawis aren't in chaos and fleeing for Europe. Let's not mess with Bashar. Let's deal with ISIS first. My Republican friends, please listen. I think that's strategically off the mark, and I think the Iranians like it that way. Syria and Iraq, including the Iraq that 5,000 American soldiers and citizens died for, and many thousands grievously wounded, and $1 trillion at least in expenditure, was to create a political space for the communities of Iraq to build a country. Iran has been taking a stick and stirring that stick. You can say that they're working with the Iraqi army. I've got videos of people living in holes to the west of Mosul because the Sunnis have been driven out by the Shia militias led by the Quds Force. Some call it ethnic cleansing. Same with Fallujah. My point being, the worst thing that could happen to Tehran is for some kind of governance to settle in Iraq and Syria, because it would go right into the streets of Iran. That's my bottom line. So if you're now sitting saying, okay, the administration's thinking, how do we exert leverage on Iran? I repeat, I don't like the sanctions anyway. I think that they're tough. I have one idea on sanctions, but try to think of at least talk about a future where 4 million Syrians can actually say, maybe we won't live in Jordan for the rest of our lives. We might actually be able to go back and make a go of it in Syria. Now that sounds crazy, but now you've heard it. Somebody in Washington actually said it. There's a horizon there to begin strategizing toward. Under what terms? To be determined. But we need to have strategic focus on what's important. And guess what? That is actually anathema, I think, to the regime in Iran. Here's my idea. It was in Forbes magazine. What angers me about sometimes life in the United States with our government is that the Treasury Department will studiously say, well, you have to be so careful about doing business with Iranian companies, even though the Secretary of State is saying we want to engage with Iran. And by the way, I don't disagree with that. I'd like to see business with Iran, culture, sports, people to people, education, on proper terms. But the danger is that, you just dealt with an entity that is through 3 layers actually run by the central bank, or it's a front company. And so then the Justice Department shows up and they've got the whole book on what you just did, but Treasury didn't show it to you. I think that you're sort of hurting the home team again. So my proposal was, let's release a master list of everyone who's a front company. Now, will that solve the problem? It might immunize some people from getting charges against them by the Justice Department if they try to do what the Secretary of State and the President told them to do. More importantly, the world will know, and so will the Iranian people, just how much of their economy is controlled by the religious foundations. More than the oil and gas income, I will venture to say, comes from their cut of business. So, and then let's have a discussion with our European allies. Do you want to put X amount of money in the hands of the regime? Let's be clear. Let's have information. I repeat, information is more powerful today than bombs and bullets.
Absolutely. Very well aware of the time. I want to take this question in the middle, please.
Actually related to Barbara's question. So.
Okay, right, gotcha. Gentleman in the front, please.
Hi, I'm Ali Dad Mafi Nizam with the West Asia Council, and very briefly, 2 things brought Iran to the table that made the deal possible. One was the sanctions that were multilateral and very biting, and the other was that the U.S. was actually talking to Iran for the first time since the revolution. Secretaries Kerry and Moniz engaging their Iranian counterparts. I thought that was hugely important, and I wonder whether that is something for the Trump administration to consider, that even if you fundamentally disagree with someone, it's better to talk to them than for them to think that you're going to be doing things to them without engaging them. Thank you.
Okay. Just behind you.
Thanks, Amy Nelson, the Stimson Center. Perhaps desperately clinging to a certain nostalgia for the current administration. Would anyone care to prognosticate on what happens in 10 years' time? Could we get the Iranians back to the table, and how would we do it?
Okay, all very good questions. I'm well aware of the time, so I'm going to ask each of the speakers. We're going to start with you, Lincoln. 2 minutes, 10 years down the time, and are we better off talking with Iran?
Always. I would even find somebody that Kim Jong-un would talk to, even if it's Dennis Rodman. Always. By the way, Americans should be polite. We should never make others lose face, even if they're killing women and children. Yes. I mean, I spent more than 2 hours with Bashar al-Assad, and he couldn't have been more charming. It was before all of the hands got bloody in 2009 with Stimson and USIP. Yeah, the best face of America is a serious face of engagement at all times with open channels. We're telling our military, our 4 stars in the Pacific, to get to know the PLA leadership, the nuclear force, the space force, get to know them as best you can, because that phone call from the bat phone to the bat phone could stop a war in the South China Sea, it could stop a war, a nuclear strike in Iran, it could stop a lot of things. So yeah, you have to have that, but let's be strategic. Let's have some thoughts. Let's know what keeps them up at night. And you know, if we're really back on the game that won the Cold War, you have serious, credible, strategic, diplomatic engagement that's polite, that's proper, that Americans are proud of, and at the same time you have leverage that the other side is asking you, can we turn that down a little bit? I pine for those days.
Mark.
So it wasn't no, just willingness to talk that brought Iran to the table. It was a willingness to talk seriously on both sides. You know, there were talks between 2006 and 2013. You know, Jalili would go on and on about peace and justice, and you know, nothing happened. It was when there was a willingness on both sides to tango. Now, what happens in 10 years? Let's hope that there is somebody on the other side that is willing also to negotiate the way Rouhani was. And that is the hope of the JCPOA. It wasn't predicated on the belief that it would cause a transformation in Iran, but there is a hope that it will. That over time, as Iran got used to abiding by limits and we got used to seeing Iran abide by its commitments, and then Iran's threat perceptions would change, and it would begin over time to moderate, and the political climate would catch up with Iran's demographics of youthful, fantastical Islamists, and we'd have a better world. That's what I hope for in 10 years. Now, but can the Iran deal last for 10 years under the next circumstances? That's the big question we've been talking about this panel. And some people are shaking their head. No, I'm not terribly optimistic about it. But I think it behooves anybody engaged in the think tank community or next in government to be, suggesting good ideas for how to keep this thing alive so we can survive all of the many challenges that it will face.
That's great. Thanks. Lacey.
I'll just second that. I think that we can't say for sure now if it will last for 10 years, particularly with the new president, knowing what's going on, elections coming in Iran as well. There's a lot of uncertainty at this point going forward, and a lot that has yet to be decided. So 10 years on is obviously there's an optimistic view and there's a pessimistic view, and I think that those are both pretty clear. As far as Trump's engagement, obviously engagement is a good idea, and I would say that in dealing with Rouhani and Zarif, yes, they are not, that Rouhani is not perhaps on equal footing as the U.S. president, but he is there because the Supreme Leader he's in negotiations because the Supreme Leader has sent him into negotiations. This is not something that he's not having these negotiations behind the Supreme Leader's back. He's not dealing without that buy-in. So I think that when you're reading Iran, yes, it's much more complicated than reading the United States, because you're not just talking to one guy. Even in the United States, you're not really just talking to one guy, right? There's a lot of competing factions, but it's important to remember that you can't just discount this deal because it was negotiated not by the Supreme Leader himself.
And David, please.
Yeah, I think first come back to what Mark said about, and Barbara, I didn't realize it'd be so easy to get out of the deal. This idea of invoking the snapback, you could always concoct a violation. I mean, I could construct an argument that Iran has a secret nuclear weapons program based on existing evidence, and then just throw it at them, and that it may be true or it may not be. I mean, so I'm a little worried that you can get out of it so easily, and then certainly our allies are going to rally with us, even if they blame us. They're going to rally with us, not Iran, And then it's a question of China and Russia, what they're gonna do. But I think in Europe, they're not gonna side with.
If there's no evidence of a nuclear weapons
Well, you
program,
have
they're
it,
not going to
yeah.
side with us.
Yeah, but they would have it. I mean, there would be some, just like there was on the enriched uranium program
Just
in North Korea.
just like in Iraq, how France was with us, they're not going to automatically be with us unless it's
Okay, well, and they
clear.
won't be automatically, I agree. So, but I think, you know, it just struck me that it's easier to get out of than I had thought. Now, I also think it's really not talking to them. I mean, certainly engagement is good. It's really meaningful negotiations, and is it the time to negotiate? And that's what we're struggling with North Korea now. I mean, we talk to North Korea all the time, but it may not be the time to negotiate with them in a meaningful way. And also, I want to just end. I don't know what will happen in 10 years. I think the world likes peace. I mean, I think we're good at heart, and there's always a movement to, you know, things go really bad to try to get them back to some kind of better place, and the U.S. is traditionally one of the leaders of that. But I think it does matter who comes in. I mean, I started my career at the beginning of the Reagan administration largely because of the Reagan administration's views on nuclear weapons, that we could fight a nuclear war and win it. Arms control was meaningless. You know, SALT II, if you remember, was a terrible deal. On and on and on. And I think that it can turn out that the people who come in and have senior positions will say this deal is more dangerous than no deal. Arms control is bad. It is a rogue regime that needs to be overthrown. And so I do think we have to wait and see. And I would argue that we should be engaging with the Republicans on this to try to get the people in that do believe in arms control, don't see the regime as something that has to be overthrown, and that tries to work out some way forward, whether it's with or without this deal. And let me just end, in the North Korean case, within 2 or 3 years, there were the 6-party talks that replaced the agreed framework, and the baseline of the 6-party talks was a lot healthier than the baseline of the agreed framework.
Okay, great. Right, I know we haven't hit everybody's questions, but there's still some refreshments available. Feel free to approach any of the speakers. Once again, I want to thank Stimson for their cooperation in organizing the event, and thank our speakers for their presentation.